My daughter screamed from behind the locked bedroom door, and I knew with a cold certainty that she did not scream like that for hunger. That sound was pure panic. It came out of her like something was already on her, like she was already being hurt. I stood in the kitchen with my hands wet from the sink, and the house felt wrong. Too quiet under the scream. No footsteps. No talking. Just that terrified cry cutting through the hallway. We had put that lock on the bedroom for a reason. We had told ourselves it was enough. Heavy door. Strong latch. A key only my wife and I carried. A small barrier between our baby and the thing that lived in the same house as her. My wife heard it too. I saw her head snap toward the hallway, her face changing before her body even moved. She did not ask what it was. She did not ask if I thought it was serious. She just ran. I ran after her, bare feet slapping the floor, my heart already beating in my throat. The sound from the bedroom got worse as we reached the door, like my daughter was running out of air and had to force it up from deep inside her. My wife grabbed the knob and yanked. It did not move. The door held. For a second, we stood there listening to our baby scream behind that wood, and something inside me almost failed. The lock was supposed to protect her. It was supposed to keep him out. My wife spun and looked at me. Her eyes were sharp and empty at the same time. She said, "Key," and it came out like a command. My hands went to my pocket and I felt nothing. No metal. No shape. My mind blanked in a way I still hated to remember. I patted myself harder like I could force the key to appear. My wife shoved her hand into her own pocket and pulled out a ring. Too many keys. The wrong ones. She tried one, then another. Her fingers shook so hard the keys clicked against the lock and the door like teeth. The scream changed again. It rose, then broke, then rose again. It sounded closer to choking than crying. I remember thinking, she is going to die in there, and we are standing outside with the wrong key. I grabbed the ring from my wife and forced myself to look. There was one key with a small notch I had filed, so we could find it by touch. I found the notch and jammed it into the lock. It stuck. I twisted, nothing. I twisted again, harder, my knuckles whitening, my wrist burning. The lock finally gave with a small click that felt too soft for what it meant. I shoved the door open. The room was dim, curtains half closed. The crib sat against the wall where we had left it. My daughter was on her back, red-faced, arms jerking, her cries coming in short, frightened bursts. And standing over her, blocking the light, was my teenage son. He was tall enough now that the crib looked small under him. His shoulders were tense, like he had been waiting for us. In his right hand he held a kitchen knife, the blade angled down toward the mattress. I saw blood on the sheet, thin streaks. I saw small cuts on my daughter's leg, bright and shallow but real. My son turned his head toward us, slow, almost curious, like we had interrupted him. Everything in this family led to this one locked door. And then my wife moved first, faster than anyone could think. I had wanted my son before I ever held him. My wife and I had planned for him like he was a promise we made to ourselves. We saved what we could. We talked about names. We argued about paint colors for a room that did not exist yet. When he finally came, I remembered thinking we had done something right for once. I remembered the weight of him in my arms and the heat of his skin, and the way my wife looked at him like the world had finally made sense. Then he cried. It started in the hospital only hours after he was born. At first it sounded normal, a hungry cry, a wet diaper cry, a new baby cry. Nurses said some bobbies just cried more. They said to burp him, swaddle him, walk him, rock him. They said it would settle down when we got home. It did not settle down. The crying followed us into the house and filled every room. It did not come in waves. It came like a machine that never shut off. My wife and I took turns holding him, but our arms got tired and our backs started to ache. We bounced him until our legs shook. We walked him up and down the hallway until our feet went numb. We drove the car in circles at night, watching the clock, waiting for him to fall asleep for more than a few minutes. Sometimes he did, but it never lasted. He cried in the morning, cried through dinner, cried past midnight. There were moments when his face went purple and his breathing hitched, and I stood there frozen, afraid he would stop breathing just to punish us for setting him down. I learned the difference between an angry cry and a pain cry, and then I learned that it did not matter, because they all blended together after enough hours. Sleep became something we talked about like it was a place we used to live. After the first few weeks, we stopped saying he is just colicky. We started saying something is wrong. My wife kept a notebook. Times, amounts of milk, burps, diapers, temperatures. She wrote down every scream like it was evidence. We took him to doctors. We drove across town to see another doctor when the first one shrugged. We tried different formulas. We tried changing the bottle nipple. We tried feeding him less, feeding him more, feeding him slower. We held him upright for an hour after he ate. We tried gas drops. We tried warm baths. We tried sitting him in a swing until the motor whined and shook. We tried silence. We tried music. We tried white noise loud enough to make our ears ring. Nothing worked for long. The doctors checked his ears, his throat, his stomach. They pressed on his belly while he screamed in their faces. They listened to his heart while my wife cried quietly and tried to hold him still. Some said reflux. Some said allergies. Some said he was sensitive. A few looked at us like we were the problem, like we were weak and dramatic and needed to calm down. I started to hate those people, not because they did not fix him, but because they made me feel like I was failing at the one job I had. Family came over at first. They brought casseroles and advice. They wanted to hold him and show us how it was done. They lasted 10 minutes, maybe 20, before their faces tightened and they handed him back like he was burning them. Friends stopped visiting. It was not cruel. It was simple. No one wanted to sit in a house where a baby screamed like an alarm. Phone calls got shorter. Invitations stopped. My wife and I stopped leaving the house because it took too much energy to pack diapers and bottles for a trip that would end with him screaming in public, and us apologizing to strangers. Our home turned into a closed box filled with sound. My wife's patience ran out in small ways first. She snapped at me for walking too slowly. I snapped back for no reason I could name. We did not fight about money or work or anything normal. We fought about whose turn it was to hold him. We fought about whether to call the doctor again, as if the next call might be the one that fixed everything. We fought about whether it was okay to put him in the crib and step into the next room for 2 minutes to breathe. Sometimes I stood at the kitchen sink with the water running, trying to drown out his crying, and I still heard it through the walls. It got into my head. It followed me into my dreams. On the rare nights I slept, I woke up in a panic because the crying had stopped and the silence felt dangerous. I watched my wife change, too. She moved like she was bracing for impact all the time. Her shoulders stayed high. Her jaw stayed clenched. If I asked her how she was, she looked at me like I had asked her to solve a puzzle while drowning. People told us this will pass. They said enjoy this time. They said Bobby's cry. But this was not a single bad day. It was a long pattern. 13 months passed like that. 13 months of broken sleep and raw nerves, and pretending at work that I was fine while my hands shook from too much coffee and not enough rest. 13 months of my wife and I trading the baby back and forth like a heavy object we could not drop. And then one day, the crying finally stopped. It was not gradual. It was not earned. It just happened, and the quiet felt so strange that I did not trust it. My wife stood in the doorway of his room and stared at him sleeping, like she was waiting for the next scream to start. When the crying finally stopped, we thought the nightmare was over. When my son stopped crying, I thought we had been given a second chance. I thought we could finally breathe and become a normal family. What happened instead was worse, because it had intent. As soon as he could crawl, he did not just explore. He damaged things and then watched our faces. He pulled dishes down from low shelves even after he learned the sound of them breaking made my wife flinch. He tipped over plants, smeared soil into the carpet, and stared at us while he did it. If I moved him away, he went right back. If I raised my voice, he looked pleased, like I had played my part correctly. When he learned to walk, the destruction followed him like a shadow. He found markers and drew on walls. He tore pages out of books and stuffed them into the toilet. He poured anything he could lift onto the floor: milk, cereal, cooking oil. It was not an accident. He chose the moment. He waited until my wife had just cleaned. He waited until I came home tired, like he wanted an audience. We tried every kind of parenting we could think of: gentle voices, firm voices, taking things away, giving him structure, reward charts, time outs that turned into screaming fights that never ended. He did not calm down. He did not learn. He acted like rules were a game and breaking them was how he won. In public, we tried to look normal. We smiled at neighbors. We nodded at other parents. We took him to family gatherings and prayed he would behave for 1 hour. He did not. He grabbed food from other people's plates. He broke decorations and laughed. He hit other children and then acted confused when adults rushed over. The worst part was how quickly he could shift his face when someone outside the family looked at him. He could look innocent for just long enough to make us seem like the problem. The shame settled on us like dust. We stopped being invited places. People stopped asking how we were doing because they did not want the real answer. My wife and I began to speak in short sentences, always tired, always listening for the next crash. Our home did not feel like a place you returned to. It felt like a place you guarded. When he started school, it got worse because there were witnesses. Teachers called us in again and again. They described tantrums that lasted an hour. They described him throwing chairs, ripping posters off walls, spitting at adults, running out of the classroom. They asked about our home life in the careful way people asked when they suspected abuse. I sat there with my hands on my knees, trying to hold myself still while my wife explained that we had been trying since the day he was born. The school tried to keep him with the other kids at first. Then they moved him. They said it was for everyone's safety, including his. He ended up in a separated class with children who had their own struggles. Even there, he stood out. He seemed to enjoy making other kids cry. He seemed to enjoy forcing adults to react. At home, he learned new ways to scare us. He started taking things that could hurt someone. Not just toys thrown in anger, but tools and kitchen items. We would find knives missing from the drawer and discover them later under his bed or tucked behind a couch cushion like a secret. When we confronted him, he smiled and said he did not know how they got there. Sometimes he said nothing at all. He just looked at my wife, then at me, measuring us. Locks were not punishment, they were safety. We put a lock on a cabinet first, then another. We moved sharp objects higher, then higher again. We locked the basement door. We locked our bedroom at night. We bought heavier hardware for the front and back doors because he began leaving the house without telling us, even when he was too young to understand what could happen to him outside. None of it made us feel safer. It only made us aware of how unsafe we already were. One afternoon, I learned that lesson in a way I never forgot. I had been in the kitchen, trying to fix a drawer he had broken. My wife had been in the living room, folding laundry and watching him with that tense patience she lived in. My son came behind me so quietly I did not hear him. I only felt him there when the air changed, like someone standing too close. The pain came fast and sharp, right into my side. For a second, my brain refused to understand it. I turned and saw him holding something small and pointed. I saw his hand moving away from me, like he had just tested a theory. My wife screamed my name. I remember her voice more than I remembered my own. I pressed my hand to my side and felt warmth spreading. I did not fall, but I almost did. My son stepped back and watched, breathing hard, not like he was scared of what he had done, but like he was excited by the reaction. It was not a deep wound that killed me. It was deep enough to leave a scar and deep enough to make me understand that he would do it again if he wanted to. We took him to doctors. We took me to doctors. We tried to explain to professionals that we were not dealing with normal anger, normal acting out, normal growing pains. We were dealing with a child who seemed to enjoy the idea of power. Treatment became a constant background noise in our lives. Appointments, assessments, new plans, new medications, side effects, promises that this one might help. Nothing stayed better. Some things made him sleepy for a while. Some things made him more restless. None of it reached whatever part of him decided to hurt. And then there were the things that happened when we were not looking, the quiet choices he made that were not loud enough to stop in time. We found burn marks where there should not have been burn marks. We found matches missing. We found little piles of melted plastic in the garage, like experiments. When we questioned him, he looked bored, as if the danger was the point and our fear was the reward. We also found what he did to living things, small, cruel acts that he hid the way other children hid candy. I could not talk about those details without feeling sick, even now. I only knew that when my wife discovered one of those acts, she went very still. She did not cry. She did not yell. She just stared at him as if she was seeing his face clearly for the first time. After that, she began to move through the house like a person living with a threat, not a difficult child, a threat. I told myself we could still fix it if we worked harder, if we found the right professional, if we kept the routine strict, if we never lost our temper. But the truth showed itself in small moments. He did not seem confused by his own behavior. He did not seem sorry. He seemed entertained. And the older he got, the bigger and stronger he became, and the more dangerous the house felt. Even with constant treatment, nothing changed. And then my wife told me she was pregnant again. My wife told me she was pregnant on a night when the house had been quiet for only a few minutes. My son had slammed his bedroom door, and the sound still seemed to hang in the hallway. My wife stood in the kitchen holding a small piece of paper like it was a threat, not a message. I waited for joy to come. It did not. All I felt was dread, heavy and immediate. My first thought was not a crib or a name. It was my son's hands. It was the knives we kept moving higher. It was the locks we kept adding. It was the way he watched pain like it was entertainment. My wife sat down hard at the table. Her face looked pale under the light. She did not cry. She did not smile. She stared at the wood grain like she could read our future in it. We spoke quietly because we had learned that sound traveled in that house. We had learned that even a normal conversation could turn into a problem if my son decided it should. I asked her what she wanted to do. The words tasted wrong. I hated that I had to ask. I also hated that I was relieved I was not the one who had to say it first. My wife said she could not bring another child into a house like this. Then she said she could not end the pregnancy without trying to believe there was still a way out of what we had been living in. She sounded like two different people in the same body, both exhausted, both terrified. We talked in fragments. We talked about money, about space, about how we barely slept, about how we already lived like we were under siege. We talked about the doctors and the plans and the medication bottles lined up like soldiers that never won a war. Then we talked about the question we had both been avoiding for years. What if this was us? What if we created this? What if another baby came and the crying never stopped again? What if we did everything right and got the same result? My wife finally looked up at me and said, very clearly, that she wanted to keep the baby. She said it like a decision that had already been made inside her, long before she spoke it out loud. I could hear fear in her voice, but I also heard something else. Defiance. A refusal to let our son take even this from us. I told her I agreed. I did not know if I meant it in a hopeful way or in a desperate way. Maybe both. We made a promise to each other that felt cruel, but it also felt like the only kind of plan we could control. We said that if the new baby showed the same severe patterns, if the same endless screaming started and never stopped, we would consider adoption. We said it softly, like we were confessing a sin. We said it because neither of us believed we could survive another year like the first one. Pregnancy did not soften our home, it sharpened it. My wife kept her body between my son and her stomach without thinking about it. She avoided turning her back on him. If he moved too quickly, she flinched. If he came into a room, she watched his hands first, then his face. My son noticed, of course he did. He hovered near her sometimes, asking questions in a sweet voice that did not match his eyes. Other times he acted bored and cruel, making louder messes, breaking things in ways that made my wife jump. He tested the edges of every moment, as if he wanted to see how far he could push before the baby even arrived. I had lived with fear for so long that I thought it had replaced every other emotion. Then, on the day my daughter was born, I felt something I had not felt in years. Relief. She came into the world and she cried like a normal baby, a loud, healthy cry that rose and fell and then stopped when she was held. She ate. She slept. She opened her eyes and looked around like she belonged here, like she expected the world to be safe. I waited for the endless scream to start. It did not. Days became weeks, and the house changed in small ways that made me feel guilty for noticing them. My wife smiled at our daughter without forcing it. I slept for 3 hours in a row and woke up confused, like my body did not know what to do with rest. I held my daughter and felt my shoulders drop for the first time in years. For the first time, we saw what normal could feel like. That was when the guilt came. It hit me in quiet moments. While rocking my daughter to sleep, I would think about my son as a baby and how I had once rocked him too. I would think about the exhausted prayers we had made back then, begging for one calm night. Now the calm had arrived, but it had not come with him. It had come around him, like a life we were finally allowed to have if we stopped looking directly at the problem. My wife seemed to feel it too. Sometimes I caught her staring at our daughter like she could not believe she was real. Then her eyes would shift toward the hallway, toward my son's room, and her face would close again. My son watched all of it. He watched our attention move away from him. He watched my wife soften for the baby. He watched me laugh once, a small laugh, and he froze like he had heard a language he hated. His eyes followed us through the house, tracking the new center of our world. And then he started to behave like a person who had just been replaced. My daughter became the center of the home because she felt safe. That was the simple truth I tried not to say out loud. When I held her, she looked at me like she recognized me. When she cried, there was a reason, and the reason could be solved. Feed her, change her, hold her close, and the storm passed. After years of living inside my son's noise, her normal sounds felt like medicine. I hated myself for how quickly I leaned into that peace. I told myself I was only doing what any father would do, protecting the smallest one. But it was more than that. I wanted an excuse to stop looking at my son, because every time I looked at him, I felt the same question rise up in me. What was he going to do next? I began scanning without thinking. When I walked into a room, my eyes checked corners, counters, and drawers. I checked for missing knives the way other men checked for their wallet. I listened for the wrong kind of silence. If my son was too quiet, my body tensed. If he was loud, my body tensed. There was no safe setting with him, only different kinds of warning. My wife changed even more than I did. She carried our daughter like a shield. She kept the baby close to her chest, and she turned her body so my son could not get behind her. Sometimes I saw her watching him with a look that was not motherly at all. It was a look you gave a stranger at night when you did not know what they wanted. My son noticed that the baby calmed us. He noticed that my wife smiled at her and that I spoke softly to her. And something in him reacted like it had been insulted. He started acting out in ways that were louder and more direct, like he needed to pull the air out of the room again and make it his. The fights became daily. Not arguments, not normal teenage pushing, but screaming matches that started over nothing and ended with doors shaking in their frames. He accused us of loving the baby more. He accused my wife of trying to replace him. He accused me of being weak, of being afraid of him, and the worst part was that he was right. He seemed to enjoy saying the words that made us flinch. My wife tried at first. She tried to talk to him like a mother. She tried to set rules and hold them. She tried to keep her voice even. But he did not want peace. He wanted impact. He wanted to see her break. He watched her face closely, and when her voice rose, I saw satisfaction settle in his eyes. I pulled back from him without announcing it. I did not sit with him. I did not ask about his day. I did not try to joke with him. I stayed near my daughter. I cleaned bottles and warmed milk and changed diapers because those jobs had an ending. Those jobs did not turn into threats. I told myself I was being useful. I told myself my wife needed me focused. But I also knew I was hiding. There were moments when I remembered the baby he had been, the one I had wanted so badly, the one I had rocked through endless months of screaming. Those memories came with a strange grief, like mourning someone who was still alive. I looked at him now, tall and restless, and I could not connect the two versions. It felt like the son I had planned for had never arrived, and this one had taken his place. The more we centered our lives around the baby, the more my son tried to poison it. He slammed doors during her naps. He played the television too loud. He stomped down the hallway outside her room, back and forth, like a threat with footsteps. When I told him to stop, he stared at me and did it again, slower, making sure I heard each step. After the worst fights, he left the house. At first, that terrified me. He was still our child. A teenage boy on the street could hurt someone, could bring trouble back to our door. But after the first few times, another feeling rose up, one I did not want to admit: relief. When he walked out, the house changed instantly. The air felt lighter. My wife's shoulders dropped. My daughter's breathing sounded louder because nothing else filled the space. Sometimes my wife and I sat in the living room holding the baby, saying nothing, listening to the quiet like it was fragile. He stayed gone for hours. Sometimes he stayed gone overnight. We did not chase him. We did not call the police. We did not call friends. We locked the doors and waited because we had learned that chasing him only fed him. He liked forcing us to run after him. He liked pulling us away from the baby, away from the small peace we had found. When he came back, he acted like nothing had happened. He would walk into the kitchen, open the refrigerator, and eat like a normal teenager. If we asked where he had been, he smiled and said, "Somewhere." If my wife raised her voice, he raised his right back, and I watched the fight ignite again like a match. I started to understand something ugly about myself. Relief could look like love, and it could also look like escape. I loved my daughter, but I also used her as a reason to stop trying with my son. I told myself he was beyond help, that we had tried everything, that we were out of options. And maybe we were. But the truth was that I felt safer when my attention stayed on the child who did not scare me. My wife began to avoid being alone with him. At first she did it quietly, like stepping into the kitchen when he entered the living room. Then it became more obvious. She waited for me before she walked past his door. She moved the baby's things into rooms she could lock. She watched him the way you watched a dog that had bitten once and might bite again. One night, after another screaming fight that ended with him kicking the wall hard enough to leave a dent, my wife stood in the hallway holding our daughter and whispered to me, very calmly, that she could not do it anymore. Soon, she could not even be in the same room with him. We stopped pretending our home was a home and started treating it like a place we had to survive. The first change was the doors. Not the front door, but the inside ones. The doors that were supposed to separate bedrooms and hallways, the doors that were supposed to be simple. We replaced them with heavier doors and stronger frames, the kind that did not splinter when someone hit them. We installed keyed locks, not the little privacy locks you could open with a coin, but real locks that needed real keys. We did not do it to punish him. We did it because we had learned that a thin door did not slow him down. We had learned that a normal lock was a joke. We had learned that if he wanted to get to you, he would, and the only chance you had was time. 10 seconds to grab the baby. 10 seconds to get a phone. 10 seconds to get your back to the wall. The sound of keys became the sound of our life, metal on metal, a small jingle that made my chest tighten. Every time I heard my wife's key ring, I knew she had decided we needed a barrier between us and our own son. Every time I slid a key into a lock, I felt like I was doing something shameful. A father locking doors inside his own house should have been unthinkable. For us, it became routine. We created a pattern without ever calling it a pattern. If my son's voice rose, we moved. If his footsteps got fast, we moved. If his bedroom door opened with that sharp click, we moved. My wife picked up our daughter first. I checked where my son was, then I checked what he could reach. Then we backed into the nearest room with a lock and closed it. Sometimes it was our bedroom. Sometimes it was the bathroom. Sometimes it was the baby's room. We chose rooms the way people chose lifeboats, not for comfort but for what they could hold and what they could block. Once we were inside, we stayed quiet. We listened. We listened for him in the hallway, for the drag of his feet, for the way he liked to stop outside a door and breathe loud enough for us to hear. We listened for the rattle of the knob, the sudden ooh-da-ah air of his shoulder against the wood, the soft tap of something hard as he tested the lock. In those moments, I held my daughter so close I could feel her heartbeat through my shirt, and I tried to keep my own breathing slow because any sound felt like bait. The worst part was the way he had freedom while we hid. He walked the house like he owned it. He opened cabinets and slammed them. He turned lights on and off. He paced. He laughed to himself. He played music too loud. He hit walls and then waited as if he expected the door to apologize for being closed. There were times we stayed locked in a room for an hour while he moved around outside, just living, just existing, and I realized something that made me feel sick. We were the prisoners. He was the one with the keys, even though he did not carry them. We tried to make the system complete. We kept keys in the same pockets. We kept spare keys on nails high up where our daughter could not reach and my son could not easily spot. We practiced locking a door with one hand while holding the baby with the other. My wife and I did not say we were practicing, but that was what it was. We were drilling for the day something happened fast. We also changed how we slept. My wife and I took turns being awake when the house felt unstable. We checked that our door was locked before we closed our eyes. We placed the baby's crib where it was harder to reach quickly from the door, not because we thought a crib should be a protected place, but because we were planning for a breach. That was how our minds worked by then. In this house, the safest room was the one with a key. The baby's room became our main safe room because it made sense on paper. The baby needed to sleep. The baby needed to be away from shouting. We kept that door locked almost all the time. My wife carried the key. I carried a copy. If we had to move quickly, that was the room we ran to. We told ourselves that one locked door between our daughter and my son was better than none. There were small moments when the locks gave us a false feeling of control. I would hear my son leave the house after a fight, and I would walk through the hallway turning keys, checking each lock, as if I could erase him with metal and wood. I would look at my wife and see the same tired hope. Maybe the system was enough. Maybe we could manage this. Maybe we could keep our daughter safe until my son grew up and left. But the system depended on one thing we could never guarantee. It depended on us being faster than him. It depended on us always having the right key in the right hand at the right moment. It depended on him staying outside the rooms we protected. It only took one mistake, one unlocked second, one door that did not latch the way it should have. Then, on an ordinary day, the system failed in the worst possible way. That morning started with shouting like so many others, but the sound felt sharper because my daughter had been asleep. My son had paced the kitchen with his shoulders high and his eyes bright, daring us to tell him no. My wife had tried to keep her voice low. I had tried to stand between them. None of it mattered. He exploded anyway. He screamed that we thought he was nothing. He screamed that the baby had stolen his life. He slammed his fist into the wall hard enough to make the picture frame jump. My daughter woke and began to fuss, and the second my wife turned toward the nursery, my son laughed like he had won. Then he grabbed his jacket and left. I watched him go through the front door and walk down the street without looking back. I stood at the window until he turned the corner. My wife locked the door behind him with a shaking hand, then checked it again, because we had learned that leaving did not always mean gone. The house stayed tense, but it also felt lighter, like a storm had moved one street over. My wife and I did not talk much after that. We moved fast and quiet, cleaning up what he had thrown, resetting the house the way you reset a room after a fight. My daughter settled again. I heard her soft sounds through the baby monitor and felt my heart slow down. Then the cry changed. It came through the monitor first, thin and sharp. Not hunger, not discomfort. It sounded like fear before a person learned words. It was high and broken with a strange catch in it, like she could not breathe right. My wife looked at me and her face emptied. She did not ask what it was. I did not answer. We both moved at the same time. As we ran down the hallway, the house felt wrong. The air felt colder. My ears filled with the sound of my daughter's terror, and everything else became distant. I remember the hallway light flickering slightly, and I remember thinking it had never done that before, even though I did not know if it was true. The nursery door was shut. It was not supposed to be shut like that. It was supposed to be shut and locked, yes, but we were the ones with the key. We were the ones who closed it. We were the ones who decided when it opened. I reached for the knob and it did not turn. The lock held. My wife shoved past me, yanked her key ring from her pocket, and dropped it once because her hands shook too hard. The keys clinked against the floor like a small alarm. My daughter screamed again, and the sound hit my chest like a punch. My wife got the right key and jammed it into the lock. It stuck for half a second, and in that half second I pictured the worst things, one after another, too fast to hold. I pictured her silent. I pictured her gone. I pictured my son standing there smiling. The lock turned. My wife threw the door open, so hard it banged against the wall. For a fraction of a second, my eyes did not understand what they saw, because it did not fit inside the rules of the house we had built. The room was dim, curtains half closed. The crib stood where it always stood, but there was a shadow moving over it. My son stood between us and the crib. He should not have been in the house. He should not have been able to get into this room. But he was there, breathing hard, shoulders rising and falling like he had been running. One of the windows was open, the curtain pushed aside in a rough way, and cold air drifted in like a sign of how he had entered. In his hand he held a knife. I did not know where he got it. We had locked away the kitchen knives. We had hidden tools. We had built our whole life around removing sharp edges. But the blade was real, catching a small strip of light as he moved it, and it looked too big in his hand, like something stolen from an adult world. My daughter's screams came from the crib beneath him. Her face was red and wet, her little arms jerking in panic, her body twisting away from him as far as the crib allowed. I saw thin lines on her skin, superficial cuts, small marks, like someone had traced the blade across her without pressing hard, as if the goal was not to kill her yet, but to show us that he could. Tiny beads of blood shone against her pale baby skin, and my stomach dropped so hard I thought I might vomit. My son turned his head and looked at us. He smiled. It was not a wide grin. It was small and controlled, like he was proud of his timing, like he had waited for this exact moment when we would be forced to see him clearly. My wife made a sound that was not a scream, not a word. It came out of her like breath forced through a cracked door. I stepped forward without thinking. Every part of me moved toward the crib, toward my daughter, because my body only knew one command: shield, grab, get her out. My son lifted the knife slightly, not to strike, but to warn me. His eyes stayed fixed on mine. He wanted me to understand that he could do it again before I reached her. Time slowed down in that thick, unreal way it did in disasters. I remember details that still made no sense. The pattern on the crib sheet. The way the open window made the curtain flutter. the smell of baby powder mixed with cold outside air, the sound of my wife's breathing turning rough. My wife moved before I did. It was like something in her switched over, something older than fear. She stepped into the room with her hands up, not pleading, not reaching, but ready. Her feet placed themselves with purpose, her shoulders squared, her chin tucked slightly. I had seen her box years ago, long before all of this, and I recognized the posture instantly. My son's eyes flicked to her, and his smile changed just a little, like he had not expected her to move that way. My wife did not speak, she did not negotiate, she did not warn him. She struck his wrist with a sharp, direct motion, knocking the knife sideways. The blade clattered against the crib rail, then dropped and skidded across the floor. In the same movement, she shoved him hard in the chest, driving him backward off balance. He stumbled into the wall near the dresser, more surprised than hurt. I lunged toward the crib, my hands already reaching for my daughter, but my eyes stayed on my son because I could not stop watching him. He recovered fast, his face twisting, his body tightening like a spring. He started forward, not toward the knife, but toward my wife. My wife paused for one breath. In that pause, I saw something in her face I had never seen before. Not anger, not sadness. Something empty and final, like she had stepped past the place where feelings lived. Then she hit him. And I knew in the same instant that I could stop her. My hand could reach her, but I did not. I did not remember deciding to move. My body just went to the crib like it belonged there. I lifted my daughter out with both hands, careful not to touch the thin cuts on her skin. She was shaking so hard her small breaths hitched. Her face pressed into my shoulder, wet with tears and spit, and she clung to my shirt with a strength that felt impossible for something so small. Behind me, my wife kept hitting my son. The sounds were dull and close, like they came through the walls of my own skull. My son made a shocked grunt at first, then he started shouting. He screamed my wife's name like it was an insult. He screamed at me too, even though I was not touching him. He called us animals. He called us weak. He told us he would kill the baby. He told us he would kill my wife. He told us he would burn the house down with us inside. He threw every threat he had ever used, but louder now, desperate, as if volume could reverse what was happening to him. I stepped backward with my daughter, keeping my body between her and the room. I saw the knife on the floor for a second, half under the crib, and my brain registered it like a loose wire. I did not bend to pick it up. I did not look for it again. I just kept moving. I left the nursery and walked down the hallway into the kitchen, still hearing everything behind me. The door to the nursery stayed open. I could not make myself close it. Closing it would have meant I accepted what was happening in there. Leaving it open meant I could still pretend I was only one step away from stopping it. I placed my daughter on the kitchen table on top of a clean towel. My hands shook so hard I had to press my palms flat against the wood for a moment, like I could push the shaking down into the table. Her cuts were small, but they looked terrible on her. Thin red lines and tiny spots of blood that should not have existed on a baby. I kept hearing my son's smile in my head, as if it had been a sound instead of a look. I turned on the faucet and ran warm water. I washed my hands because my mind demanded a routine, something normal to hold onto. Then I dabbed at the cuts with a clean cloth. My daughter sobbed in short bursts, then paused, then sobbed again, as if her body could not decide if the danger was still there. From the hallway, my son's voice rose and fell in ugly waves. He screamed that my wife was crazy. He screamed that he had done nothing. He screamed that he would have finished it if we had been slower. That line reached the kitchen like smoke. It filled my lungs. My knees went weak for a second, and I had to lean closer to the table so I did not fall. My wife did not answer him. She did not argue. She did not plead. The only response was the sound of her moving and the hard, repeated impacts that told me she had not stopped. I cleaned each cut carefully. I told myself I was doing the most important thing. I told myself my daughter needed me. I told myself I had to stay focused because panic would make my hands clumsy. But under that deeper, there was another truth. If I stayed in the kitchen, I did not have to look at my son. I did not have to see his face as my wife broke him down. I did not have to choose again. I found the bandages with numb precision, the way you followed steps in the dark. I wrapped the smallest ones around her tiny arms and legs where I could, not too tight, just enough to cover. My daughter's crying began to slow. She watched my face with wide eyes, her cheeks wet and shining. I whispered to her, not words she could understand, just sound meant to soothe. My voice came out flat and strained, like it belonged to someone else. My son's screams changed. They stopped being threats and became insults. Then they became pleading. Then they became raw noise with no meaning. I heard him spit words I had never heard from him before, words that did not even fit in his mouth, like he had saved them for a moment when nothing else worked. And still my wife kept going. A part of me waited for her to stop because she was tired, because she had to breathe, because even rage had limits. Another part of me waited for my son to break free and come running into the kitchen to finish what he started. My eyes kept flicking to the kitchen knives we no longer kept in the drawer, to the empty spaces where danger used to be. I imagined him in the doorway. I imagined my wife falling behind him. I imagined my daughter on the table, alone for a second. Time stretched into something slow and unreal. My daughter's crying faded to soft hiccups. Her eyelids drooped. She pressed her face into my hand, and I lifted her again, holding her against my chest. I walked small circles in the kitchen without thinking, rocking her the way I had rocked my son when he was a baby, before we knew what he would become. In the other room, my son finally went quiet. The silence did not mean safety. It felt worse than the screaming. It felt like a door closing. I listened, frozen in place, my daughter heavy and warm against me. The silence held for a few seconds. Then I heard my wife's breathing, rough and fast, and I heard movement that told me she was still there with him. My daughter fell asleep in my arms, while my wife kept doing what I refused to stop. He protected the baby, but he did not protect his son. That was what I understood in that kitchen, holding my sleeping daughter, listening to the last sounds of my wife in the nursery. When my wife finally walked out, her footsteps sounded strange, like she did not fully belong to her own body anymore. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at me, then at the baby, then back at me. We both stood there in silence, and I felt a question rising between us that neither of us had ever expected to ask. My wife stood in the kitchen doorway like she had walked out of a different life. Her hair stuck to her forehead with sweat. Her chest rose and fell too fast. Her hands hung at her sides, and I noticed them before I noticed her face. Her knuckles had swollen. The skin looked split in a few places, and there was blood on her fingers that did not belong to her. She looked at my daughter first. My daughter slept against my chest, bandages bright against her skin. Then my wife looked at me. Neither of us spoke. The house around us felt huge and hollow, like every room waited for the next sound. My wife took one step into the kitchen and stopped again, as if she had forgotten why she came. Her eyes moved past me toward the hallway, toward the nursery, toward the place she had left him. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She swallowed hard, and her throat worked like she was trying to force something down that would not go. I asked very quietly where he was. My wife stared at the floor tiles. She said he was in the nursery. She said it flat, like a report. Then her shoulders shook once, just once, and she pressed the heel of her swollen hand against her mouth as if she could hold the shaking in. I shifted my daughter higher on my shoulder and felt her warm breath on my neck. I wanted to keep her asleep. I wanted to keep her in a world where her brother did not exist. My wife walked to the sink and turned the water on. She held her hands under it and flinched, but she did not stop. The water ran pink for a moment, then clear. She stared at her own hands like she did not recognize them. Then she whispered, "I think I killed him." I did not answer her right away because my brain refused to accept the sentence. If I answered, it would become real. I listened for any sound from upstairs, a cough, a groan, anything. There was nothing. My wife turned away from the sink and started walking down the hall toward the bathroom. Halfway there, she stopped and looked back at me. Her eyes were wide and blank at the same time. She asked me if we should call an ambulance. That question landed between us like a heavy object. I felt something inside me move, not like guilt, not like panic, but like a door closing. I pictured police cars outside. I pictured neighbors watching. I pictured my daughter being taken from us, passed to strangers, while people asked why we had allowed it, why we had not stopped it sooner, why our home had locks on the inside doors. I pictured my son looking at the officers with that small smile and telling them everything in a way that made him sound like the victim and us sound like monsters. I pictured him coming back to the house after, angrier, smarter, trained by consequences we could not control. And under all that, I pictured the knife in his hand over the crib. I heard my own voice, low and rough, say something I did not expect. I said I did not care anymore. The words shocked me as soon as they left my mouth, but they also felt true. Years of fear had burned something out in me. The part that believed in fixing things had died quietly somewhere along the way. My wife stared at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once, slow, like she understood even if she hated it. She turned and went into the bathroom. I heard the shower turn on. At first I thought she was washing blood off her hands. Then I heard a sound that made my stomach tighten. It was her crying, muffled by running water. Not loud, not dramatic. It was the kind of crying that came from deep inside a person when there was nothing left to hold on to. I sat at the kitchen table with my daughter still against my chest, and I listened to my wife break in a room where she could lock the door. Minutes passed. I counted them by the beat of my daughter's breath. I kept waiting for my son to burst into the kitchen. I kept waiting for him to scream that he would call the police himself, that he would tell everyone what we did, that he would finish the job he started with the baby. Nothing happened. When the shower stopped, the silence felt even louder. I laid my daughter gently in her crib in our room with the door locked. I watched her for a few seconds to make sure she stayed asleep. Then I took the key and walked down the hall toward the nursery. My steps sounded too loud. The carpet seemed thinner. I could smell the room before I reached it. A mix of baby powder, sweat, and something sharp and metallic that made my mouth fill with saliva. The nursery door was still open. The knife still lay where it had skidded near the crib. I did not touch it. I stepped around it like it was alive. My son lay on the floor near the dresser. One side of his face had swollen. His lip looked split. There were dark marks on his neck and chest, and his arms were bent in a way that made my skin crawl. He did not move. For a second, I honestly thought he was dead. Then his chest rose, barely, but it rose. He made a wet sound like he tried to swallow, and it hurt too much. His eyes opened halfway and rolled toward me. When he saw me standing there, something flickered in his expression. Not fear, not regret. It looked like hatred, tired but intact. His mouth moved. He did not have enough breath for a full sentence, but I heard him force out a few words anyway. He said he would get me for this. I stood there and watched him breathe. My hands did not reach for him. My body did not kneel beside him. I waited for the part of me that was still a father to rise up. It did not. I walked back to the kitchen and closed the nursery door behind me, not to trap him, but to separate the air. My wife came out of the bathroom with a towel around her shoulders, hair wet, face red from crying. She looked at me without asking, and I knew she saw the answer in my eyes. He was alive, I told her, barely. She sank into a chair. Her hands shook now that the rage had drained away. She stared at her swollen knuckles, and then she whispered, "We cannot do this anymore." I said, "No, we cannot. We talked about calling for help again, but the words went in circles. Every option led to the same fear. If we called, we invited the world into our private disaster. If we did not call, we became something else, something cold, something final. My wife looked toward the hallway. She asked me what happened next if we did nothing. She asked if he would kill the baby the next time. She asked if he would kill her. She asked if he would burn the house down while we slept. I did not have answers. I only had one clear goal left: keep the baby alive. That was when we made the decision that defined the rest of our lives. We used the basement in-law suite the way it had been meant to be used for guests, except we were not guests. We were hiding in our own home. We moved a crib down there. We carried diapers and formula and clothes. We brought blankets and a small radio and anything that made noise, because silence made us listen for him too closely. We did it fast, like we expected him to come limping down the stairs at any moment. My wife kept looking at the door that led upstairs, the one at the bottom of the stairs. She locked it from our side and checked it twice. Then she sat on the basement bed and stared at her hands again, as if she waited for them to tell her who she was now. I sat on the basement floor with my back against the wall, listening. Upstairs the house creaked, pipes ticked, the building settled, normal sounds that now felt like signals. I waited for my son to start moving. I waited for him to scream. I waited for him to come down and rattle the locked door. This was where fear turned into a cold, final boundary. We stayed in the basement with our baby and the locked door between us and him. And the strangest thought came to me as I listened to the empty stairs. Upstairs, my son was still alive, and now we waited to see what he did next. I read the responses the way a man read a verdict he already expected. My therapist had told me to write it down, all of it, without trying to make myself look better. He said the truth had weight, and carrying it alone had already bent my spine for decades. So I put the story online, not because I wanted attention, but because I wanted to see if strangers would name the thing I had never named. When the comments started coming in, it did not feel like a conversation. It felt like a courtroom with no judge. Every person arrived with their own law. Some people spoke like they had lived inside a violent home. Others spoke like they had only seen violence on a screen. But all of them spoke with confidence, as if the right answer was simple. The first group focused on one thing only: the baby. They saw the knife over the crib and decided the rest of the story was background noise. They believed the only moral duty in that room was to stop the immediate threat. They pointed out that my son had already cut her. Even if the cuts were shallow, he had crossed the line from anger into actual harm. In their eyes, that meant my wife's reaction came from survival, not cruelty. They also talked about time, how long fear changed a person. They understood that years of threats made calm choices harder. They understood that a family did not reach that moment by accident. They treated the locked doors and keys like evidence that we had been living under pressure for a long time. Some of them even said my focus on the baby in the kitchen, cleaning and bandaging, was the only clear action anyone took that day. In their minds, I did the job a father was supposed to do. I protected the smallest one. Reading that made my chest loosen in a way I hated. Relief felt like permission. It felt like someone finally said I had not been completely wrong. But even in that group, there was a warning I could not ignore. Some of them admitted there was a line between defense and punishment. They did not say my wife was wrong to strike him in the first seconds. They said the danger was real and it had to be stopped. But they also hinted that once the knife was gone and the baby was out, something else started. Something darker, something harder to justify. The second group did not care about my fear. They cared about control. They looked at the same moment and saw a moral collapse. In their eyes, the knife threat ended when my wife knocked it away and shoved him back. After that, they believed anything continued was not protection anymore. It was retaliation. It was rage using the excuse of danger. They said that standing still made me part of it, not an observer. not a man who froze, a man who chose. They argued that I had a hand in what happened because I stayed in the kitchen and let it go on. They focused on the time between the first hit and the silence that came later. They treated that stretch of time as the true event, not the knife itself. They also attacked the decision that came after, not calling for help, not calling police, not calling anyone. They said that choice turned an emergency into a private punishment. In their view, even if my son was a threat, we still had a duty to stop the bleeding and bring in adults who could handle it. They argued that hiding it did not protect the baby. It protected us from consequences. That group made me flinch, not because they were cruel, but because their words felt sharp and clean. They made a clear distinction between stopping an attack and continuing after control was regained. And I knew in my bones that my wife had kept going after control was regained. I had heard it. I had counted breaths. I had listened for a sound that meant it ended. I wanted to argue back in my head. I wanted to say they had not lived in my house. I wanted to say they had not seen his smile. I wanted to say that when you watched your own child cut a baby, something inside you snapped and did not come back. But another part of me remembered my own sentence in the kitchen. I did not care anymore, and it sounded worse when I read it on a screen, separated from the terror that created it. The third group did something different. They did not treat the story like one moment. They treated it like a long collapse. They looked at the heavy doors and keyed locks and said the system itself was proof we had been damaged long before the knife. They saw that we were the ones hiding, not him. They saw that we built a fortress inside our own home, and they called that a sign that normal parenting ended years earlier. In their view, the nursery scene was not a sudden monster appearing. It was the final step in a chain. They also pointed out something that hurt because it felt true. They said shifting our attention to the baby, the calmer child, might have fed my son's need to regain control. Not because the baby did anything wrong, but because my son had always used chaos as a tool. When peace entered the house, he attacked the peace. When love flowed toward someone else, he tried to poison it. That group described our coping style in simple terms: isolation, avoidance, survival routines. They did not excuse what we did, but they also did not pretend it came from nowhere. They saw my wife's training, the way her body moved like it had a plan, and they saw my numb focus in the kitchen, and they called it what it was. A family that had been in crisis for so long that crisis became the only language we spoke. I read those comments slower than the others. They did not feel like accusations. They felt like someone tracing the outline of a burned house and saying the fire started long before the flames reached the roof. I kept scrolling until my eyes blurred, until the words stopped being words and became noise. I wanted one camp to be the truth so I could hold onto it and stop falling, but none of them gave me that. 3 views, and none of them erased the blood on the floor. What surprised me was how each camp made room for the same uncomfortable fact. The baby had been in danger. My son had been out of control. And still, my wife had gone too far and I had let her. I sat with the screen glowing in my lap while my daughter's house slept around me, decades later. My grandchildren's toys sat in the next room. The present looked soft and safe. But my mind stayed in that nursery, in the hallway, in the kitchen. It stayed with the sound of keys and the sound of fists, and the moment my own moral line went quiet. And then I noticed a new pattern forming in the responses. Some people stopped talking about the knife. They stopped talking about the beating. They started asking about what came next. But other commenters would ask an even harder question: what about the weeks after? The next wave of responses did not circle the knife anymore. It circled the phone we never picked up. A fourth group treated that choice like the center of the whole story. To them, the worst part was not my wife striking my son. It was what we did after. They believed emergency help should have happened no matter what my son had done. They listed all the ways it could have gone wrong. He could have died on the nursery floor while we hid downstairs. He could have had a brain injury and lived in pain. He could have woken up and called the police first, and then we would have looked like the criminals, not the parents protecting a baby. They kept returning to the same point in different words. A violent teenager still had basic human rights. Even if he was dangerous, even if he was cruel, even if he had cut a baby, he was still a person on the floor with injuries, and we were still the adults in the house. That group did not ignore our fear. They said fear was real. They admitted my son had turned the home into a trap, but they insisted fear did not remove responsibility. It only made it harder. In their eyes, there were safer channels than what we did. Police, a hospital, mental health crisis services, whatever existed at the time. Anything that involved witnesses and paperwork and protection. Reading that felt like a light aimed at a corner I had tried not to look at for years. Because the truth was, part of why we did not call was not only fear of him. It was fear of exposure. We did not want anyone to see our locked doors. We did not want anyone to see the nursery floor. We did not want anyone to ask how a family reached a moment where a mother could beat her son and a father could stand in the kitchen listening. I wanted to push back and say they were judging from a safe distance, but the words would not form into a clean defense, because when I pictured an ambulance arriving, I pictured safety for my daughter too. I pictured professionals taking control while my wife and I finally stopped carrying it alone, and that made me realize something that stung. We did not call because control mattered more to us than rescue did. A fifth group came from a different angle. They talked less about my family and more about the world outside our front door. They treated my son like a threat that had already outgrown our home. They pointed to the years of violence, the school problems, the knives, the threats. They assumed it had never been contained. They believed that if he was willing to cut a baby in her crib, then he could do worse to someone else later, a neighbor, a girlfriend, a stranger who looked at him wrong. In their minds, the baby incident was not random. It was a warning. That group argued that separation was the only immediate move that made sense, not as punishment, not as revenge, but as containment. They described the basement as a crude barrier that bought time. They did not praise the beating, but they did not spend long on it either. Their main concern was stopping the next attack, whatever it would be. When I read those responses, I felt a familiar coldness in my chest. It was the same coldness I had felt in the kitchen when I said I did not care anymore. It was a survival feeling, not a moral one. It reduced everything to a single question. Who is going to get hurt next, and how do you prevent it? That group made my choice feel practical, and that was dangerous, because practical could become comfortable if you let it. Practical could turn into an excuse to forget the face on the nursery floor, to forget that the threat had been my son and also my child. The sixth group did not argue like the others. They tried to name what my words sounded like, not what they proved. They talked about trauma and moral injury, about what happened to people who lived in fear for years. They described the numbness I had admitted, the mechanical way I cleaned my daughter's cuts, the way I locked doors without thinking, the way I listened to violence and did not move. They believed I had shut down because my mind could not keep feeling fear and guilt at the same time. They said long-term terror could flatten emotions until the only thing left was function. Protect the baby, breathe, lock the door, wait. They did not call it bravery, they called it damage. They also described my wife's violence as a breaking point, not a plan. They imagined her body going into training mode because her mind could not handle the horror in front of her. They saw a mother who snapped when she saw blood on her baby. Reading that did not comfort me. It made me feel exposed in a different way, because it suggested there was no clean reason for what we did, no single explanation that could make it right, just a house full of people pushed past the edge. That group also pointed out my guilt. They treated it like evidence that I understood the cost. If I had been proud, if I had celebrated it, then maybe I would have been something else entirely. But I had carried it like a stone. I had avoided looking at it directly, but I had never dropped it. They said understanding trauma was not the same as approving actions. That line stayed with me because it forced me to hold two things in my hands at once: my daughter's small cuts and my son's swollen face. The knife and the fists, the terror and the aftermath. If I tried to hold only one, the story turned into a simple lesson. But my life had never been simple again after that day. I scrolled until the light from the screen made my eyes ache. I reread parts I hated. I reread parts that felt like mercy. And I realized every camp was trying to do something that I had spent decades failing to do. They were trying to put the story into a box with a label. Protect the baby, monster son, evil parents, broken system, call for help, no choice. But my memory did not fit into one label. It spread out like a stain. The hardest stories are the ones where two truths exist at once. My daughter needed protection. That was true in a way so simple it hurt. She was an infant. She could not run. She could not fight. She could not understand why someone leaned over her with a blade. And my son suffered extreme violence in our home, and I did not stop it. That was also true. He was dangerous, but he was still my child. He lay on a nursery floor and told me he would get me for it, and I walked away and locked myself behind a door. The comments ended, but the feeling did not. The online courtroom dissolved, and I still sat there with the verdict I could not read. Not guilty, guilty, both. I turned the phone face down and listened to the quiet house around me. In the distance, I heard a small sound from a different room. One of my grandchildren shifting in sleep. A soft, safe sound that should have calmed me. Instead, it made me think of another small sound from another house. My daughter's terror cry through the baby monitor. The way it changed everything in 1 second. And I knew why the question about the weeks after had mattered so much to the people reading. Because the knife scene was a flash. The beating was minutes. But what we did next lasted for weeks, and then for the rest of our lives. So after the son left and never returned, what was I supposed to do with my guilt now? Weeks passed in the basement like time in a shelter. I listened to the house above us the way people listen to weather. Every creak meant movement. Every thud meant my son was awake. Some nights I heard him pace for hours, dragging something heavy across the floor, stopping, then starting again. Other nights there were sharp crashes, like he threw furniture just to prove he could still reach us through sound. My wife and I did not go upstairs. We did not call his name. We did not ask if he needed help. We kept our voices low for the baby, but also for ourselves, as if loud speech might unlock the door. I fed my daughter. I changed her. I watched her sleep. I kept staring at the basement door, waiting for the handle to shake. Then the noises changed. They became less like packing and more like tearing. The sound of wood cracking. The sound of glass breaking. Once, I heard water running for a long time, then stopping suddenly. I pictured him flooding a sink just to watch the ceiling stain. I pictured him setting a fire and smiling while smoke filled the rooms we loved. Still, we stayed downstairs. The night I realized I had stopped thinking of him as my son was the night I started thinking of him as an animal in the attic, a dangerous thing above my head that might come down if the barrier failed. I hated myself for that thought, but it arrived on its own. I did not invite it. Years of fear had trained my mind to sort people into two groups, safe and not safe. After a while, the house went quiet. The first day of silence did not calm me. It terrified me. Silence meant planning. Silence meant he could be standing at the top of the basement stairs, holding his breath, waiting for us to open the door. My wife and I barely slept. We sat together in the basement room with the baby between us, listening for a footstep that never came. The second day of silence felt worse. The third day felt impossible. My mind kept creating sounds that were not there. I heard a door close when no door moved. I heard breathing that did not belong to me or my wife. On the fourth day, I could not stand it anymore. Not because I wanted to see him, but because I needed to know if the quiet meant he had left or if it meant he was dead upstairs, hidden in some corner we would have to face eventually. I unlocked the basement door and held my breath, as if the air above it might be poisoned. The stairs felt steeper than I remembered. Each step creaked under my weight, and I paused after everyone, listening. My hands shook so badly I had to keep one on the railing to steady myself. I told myself I would turn back if I heard anything at all. I reached the top. The main floor looked like a place that had been fought over. Drawers had been pulled out and dumped. A chair lay on its side with one leg snapped. A cabinet door hung open at an angle that made it look injured. The living room rug had been cut in long lines, as if someone had dragged a blade across it for pleasure. The air smelled stale and sour, like old sweat and spilled food left too long. I walked from room to room and found more damage. Picture frames shattered, a lamp broken, a door with a hole punched through it. The kitchen sink had been clogged and overflowed at some point, leaving dried water marks on the cabinet doors below. It looked like he had tried to peel the house apart from the inside. I called his name once. My voice sounded wrong in that ruined space, too small. No answer. I checked his bedroom. The bed was stripped. The closet was half empty. A few drawers were missing entirely, like he had pulled them out and taken them with him. The window was unlocked. That was when I understood he was gone. I stood there in the quiet and waited for a feeling to arrive. Grief, relief, rage, anything that matched what I was seeing. But what came first was numbness, and then a slow, sick relief that made me ashamed. He had left and the house was still standing. My daughter was alive in the basement. My wife was alive. I could breathe without hearing his footsteps above my head. I went downstairs and told my wife he was gone. She stared at me for a long time, then covered her face with her hands and cried without sound. I could not tell if she cried because he left or because he lived long enough to leave. The months after that were not healing, they were repairs. We fixed doors, we replaced glass, we patched walls, we cleaned stains that had soaked into wood. We worked like people trying to erase evidence, even though no one else had been there to see it. Every nail I hammered felt like a decision to keep surviving. Every piece of broken furniture I carried out felt like another part of our old life being thrown away. Eventually we moved. We did not tell many people why. We said we needed a change. We said it was better for the baby. The real reason was simpler. We could not sleep in that house anymore without hearing the sound of keys and crying through a monitor. The walls had held too much. In the new home, my body stayed tense for a long time. I kept checking locks. I kept watching windows. I kept listening for a footstep that did not belong. But slowly the fear faded in small ways. The baby grew into a little girl who laughed easily. She did not flinch at raised voices because there were fewer raised voices. The air felt lighter. It almost felt normal if I did not think too hard. We never saw my son again. No phone calls, no letters, no police at the door, no hospital asking for family, just absence, wide and permanent. Sometimes I thought that was his last cruelty. He did not even give us an ending we could understand. He left a question mark in our lives and let it rot there. Years turned into decades. My wife aged with a kind of quiet hardness. She loved our daughter and our daughter loved her, but there was a part of my wife that stayed in that nursery forever. Sometimes I watched her hands when she thought no one noticed. She would flex her fingers slowly, as if she remembered pain in her knuckles even when there was none. We did not talk about that day often. When we did, the words felt dangerous, like they could open something we had sealed. Then my wife died. It was not dramatic, it was not violent. It was one more quiet ending in a story full of loud beginnings. After the funeral, the house felt too empty and my daughter asked me to live with her. She had a family of her own, children, laughter, a life built on safety. I moved in because I wanted to be near what we had protected. In therapy, my therapist asked me to say the two feelings out loud. the ones I kept trying to separate. I told him I felt guilty. I told him I felt relief. The guilt never left because I had allowed violence to happen in my home, and I had not called for help when I should have. I had protected my baby, but I had abandoned my son in a way I could not soften with language. The relief never left because my daughter lived, because my wife lived long enough to see a peaceful home, because I slept without waking to terror. I did not know where my son went. I did not know if he died young or grew old. I did not know if he hurt other people or if he disappeared into a life so ordinary one would believe what he had done as a teenager. People asked me sometimes if I wanted closure. I never did. Closure meant contact. Contact meant a door opening again, and I had spent the rest of my life building doors that stayed shut. The crisis ended, but the question did not. So I asked the same question now that I had asked strangers online because I could not answer it alone. Was I responsible for what I allowed, even if it may have saved my baby? When trust was already broken and fear ruled the house, what did protection even mean? If the outcome was safety, did intent matter or did it make it worse? If you listened this far, I wanted you to weigh it for yourself, not as entertainment but as a real choice between two wrong options. Decide where the line was and who crossed it first. There was no clean ending, only the choice of what lesson we take from it.